I think we owe them a huge debt of warmth and support, just for the fact that they're prepared to get up there and do that. So that's my starting position, absolutely. So investors know as much as a founder knows that 9 out of 10 startups will fail, or even worse, 19 out of 20 startups will fail. So most of the experience that we get in startups will be with startups that failed. But I guess it always made us look for other people who were also marginalized. So most of my friends growing up weren't the cool kids, they were the kids that were unpopular. And so we managed to hold together a weekly 1-hour chat show that was all written, which was all text, and build an audience that way. Most people in tech startups start out thinking this is all about building interesting technology, only to discover that this is mostly about sales and marketing.
Get ready for an insightful episode with Alan Jones, a tech industry veteran and startup expert. In this podcast, Alan reflects on his journey from tech reporter to radio host, sharing valuable insights into entrepreneurship. He discusses the impact of storytelling in the startup realm, emphasizing the need for compelling narratives to engage investors and customers. Alan also sheds light on the significance of supportive feedback in the startup ecosystem, drawing from his extensive experience in advising and investing in early-stage startups. Tune in to discover the key factors investors look for and gain a wealth of knowledge from Alan's rich background in the tech and startup landscape. Welcome, Alan Jones, to Startup Journeys Founders Unplugged podcast.
Thank you for having me, Paul. It's an honor.
Yeah, it's an honor to have you as well. And you have a long history in the industry. And so I'll get straight into the first question. Could you share a personal anecdote from your early career that significantly influenced your path in the startup ecosystem, and what motivated you to delve into this industry in the first place?
Yeah, so I'm getting on in age, and my early career was a long time ago. I started as a tech reporter writing for computer magazines, and computer magazines had an outsized influence in the Australian economy, or the world economy, I suppose, at that time, because most organizations, public and private, were engaged in replacing clipboards and typewriters with personal computers, putting a computer on everybody's desk. And as the person in an organization, I had to decide what computers the organization bought and how to connect them together and what to connect them to. You had to read a computer magazine to get that information. And so I was just a young strip of a lad, but I was being sent overseas all the time to Silicon Valley to attend conferences, expos, product launches, and interviewing executives. And that repeated exposure to Silicon Valley and startup culture made me start to fall in love with the industry that I was reporting on. And then I remember very clearly an inflection point where I first saw the commercial web for the first time. And a website with ads on it was basically a magazine that had no barriers to the cost of distribution, so you could have unlimited global circulation if you had a website. Whereas with a print magazine, I was always limited by how much we could afford to put, charge it for on the newsstand. And so I realized that the web was probably going to have a pretty disruptive influence on the magazine industry. And if you've walked into a newsagent in the last few years, I was right about that one. So I decided to take the skills that I had and find a way to jump across. And so one of the early experiences that I had was with a friend and colleague of mine, Darren Edwards, and I. We were both editors of computer magazines, and in the very, very early web, we started a weekly chat show. And it grew like crazy, to the point where, even in the early days, this would have been about 1995. We had a simultaneous audience for our weekly chat show of 5,000 or so listeners at any point in the show. But by far the most extraordinary thing about that show was that it was all text. the internet at that time, we didn't have enough bandwidth on the internet in Australia for our chat show to go out via audio. We couldn't record it in audio, and people couldn't listen to it in audio. And so we managed to hold together a weekly 1 hour chat show that was all written, which was all text, and build an audience that way. It was extraordinary, the demand that we saw in people to find a new medium that was global and was connected to them.
Yeah, it's amazing. And look, the young people today couldn't even relate to that, like the ones that didn't grow up pre-internet. But, we're probably a similar age. And, it was very different in those days. And it was really like a revolution, I guess, when the web came along, just like AI is now, or maybe AI is even more so.
Yeah. The tech industry keeps looking for economic sectors where the means of distribution between a customer and the maker of a product or a service, where that distribution is tightly controlled. Because where there's tight control of distribution, there's typically somebody rent-seeking there. There's probably somebody sitting there not adding as much value as they're taking out. So you can think of that early experience, to broadcast on FM or AM radio in Australia, you needed to have a broadcast license, and they cost millions of dollars. And so unless you're already a powerful media mogul, you can't really afford to start a new radio station very easily, unless you go community, right? And community radio is limited about what it can do and how much it can charge. So that's an example of distribution. So I think our early audience on that online chat show was all about people looking for new voices, talking about new things, and we were taking an end run around the people who controlled distribution. And you can look at the same in streaming television and music. And then you can think about industries like food delivery. So food delivery was controlled distribution for a long time, and then the internet blew it up and made it available for nearly any provider of food and nearly any consumer.
Yeah, and I mean, look at us now, just both from home doing this podcast, so that was unthinkable before. And also you're involved in Disrupt Radio. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so Disrupt Radio, the awesome Benjamin Roberts is actually started as an FM radio brat. He did work experience in a commercial FM radio station and fell in love with the industry and basically never left. But he came back after some successful career time in the United States, back to Australia, and took a look at how the FM radio industry was failing in Australia. And his hypothesis is that the reason for that is that the programming of commercial FM radio hasn't changed in like 50 years. It's still fundamentally a couple of annoyingly chirpy people in the mornings cracking jokes and playing music, and then some also annoying chirpy people in the afternoons playing slightly different music and cracking slightly different jokes. And so, it's no surprise that if you don't change with the times, that you'll start to lose your audience. And so Ben's hypothesis is that one thing that unites younger generations these days is they no longer believe in what we bought into. And that was, that if you put your head down and work hard and follow a career path, choose a good employer and they'll take care of you for your entire career, and you'll move gradually up the ranks. And then you'll be able to afford your own home and retire, So our kids rightfully no longer believe in that as a model, and where they see people building financial wealth for themselves and self-fulfillment in expressing who they are and what they want to do with their lives, they see entrepreneurs. And so a new commercial FM radio station started earlier this year in Melbourne called Disrupt Radio, and you can listen to it anywhere on the DAB plus part of the FM radio band. And you can also find it on the internet at disrupt.radio. And it's 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, every day of the week, a lot like a commercial FM radio station that you're familiar with. But it's all talk, and it's all about startups and entrepreneurship. So Megan and I, we have a show called The Advisory Board, where people write into us with their problems and their questions, and we do our best to help them with those problems and questions in the course of a 1 hour show. And it's been growing, pretty rapidly and thriving. Advertisers seem to love it, and audience is growing all of the time.
That's awesome. And I'm not surprised because I've been listening to the podcast with Megan. I was just saying before to you that there's a really good dynamic happening between the two of you. And obviously you both have, wealth of knowledge in the industry. And just on that, I was going through your LinkedIn profile and I don't think I could reach the bottom of experiences that you've had. I was going to ask, you said, that you're like, are you 100 years old, Alan? Like, seriously, like, for someone to do all of that, they'd have to be 100 or 200 years old.
Well, I think part of it is I am sort of a bit of a gypsy. I grew up with not ethnically but spiritual gypsy parents. My parents before I left home at 17, I lived in 28 houses and one boat with my family. And a thing about a startup career is that roles can be, and companies, the organization that employs you or the organization that you start can be a short-term thing often. Sometimes you'll learn a lot of valuable experiences from something in a very short time, and then you'll pivot and go do something else. And so, some of the roles on my LinkedIn profile, haven't been for very long. They certainly haven't been for 5 years. So, it ends up in a long LinkedIn profile. Another thing that I like to try and do is that I'm an angel investor, right? I invest in other people's tech startups, and I like to try and record when and how I first invested in a company. So there was a period of time there where I added every company that I invested in to my LinkedIn profile. I thought it might help them and help me. I've stopped doing that now. But what I do now is I just add myself if I'm on an advisory board or on the executive board.
Yeah, I'll get back to a little bit later on advice, in investing or what startups founders should do. I actually just read on your recent blog post, you're talking about, what you need, what VCs will invest in, what are the different things, there's 4 different things. We'll get into that in a sec, but
Correct.
I'm really interested in that, you growing up and moving around, living in 28 locations. Tell us more about that and why all that was happening.
Yeah, I've always sort of allied with. I've always felt a brother to people who are marginalized and disadvantaged and sort of on the margins. And I think that actually comes from my family upbringing because we were a family of 5. I have 2 younger brothers, and my father was an entrepreneur, and my mother is an adventurer, and my father and mother took us to several different countries and many different cities, and we moved schools and homes a lot, and that meant that my brothers and I were strangers again and again and again, trying to introduce ourselves, trying to find a niche in the little ecosystem which is a school, and kids can be pretty cruel, right? So my brothers and I would show up with the wrong haircut and the wrong clothes, listening to the wrong music, not having any of the right jargon and slang, and so again and then again, we felt like marginalized. We felt like they're outsiders. That brought us closer together as brothers, and we still have a strong link. But I guess it always made us look for other people who were also marginalized. So most of my friends growing up weren't the cool kids. They were the kids that were unpopular, and I think that was where that came from. So ever since then, I've looked for an opportunity to help other people on the margins and identified with them and sought them out. Another thing that I think really changed about that was I observed fairly early on how easy it is to change who you apparently are, and also how useful it can be to learn how to tell your story in a compelling way, because most audiences won't give you all the time that you need to tell the whole story. Yeah. You have to come up with something, short and punchy that they connect to, that makes sense to them, and then they might welcome you into their little tribe.
Yeah, it's really interesting background. What are some of the cities and countries that you travel around to as a child?
We live up and down the east coast of Australia, and so I was born in Melbourne. We lived in Canberra. We lived in Sydney. In Sydney alone, we lived in 12 different parts of Sydney. lived in Auckland in New Zealand for a while, and over in the UK for a few years and a few different places there. My dad was from the UK, came out to Australia as a 10-pound migrant when he was 21, and he came out to escape his family and also the English class system. So there was something unsettled in him that he didn't understand, and looking back on that, I think what he didn't understand about himself was that he was an entrepreneur, and there was no room for an entrepreneur in post-war British class system. If he came from a working class family and there was no opportunity for a working class person to participate in entrepreneurship, that was something reserved for the upper classes. And if you're a white collar professional, maybe you could, if you're a dentist, you'd be the best dentist you could be for the town in which you lived. If you're a butcher, you'd do the same. There wasn't even that sort of franchise entrepreneurship where you might try and strive to have a dentist practice in 2 towns. That was just not a thing that 1950s Britain did. And so, because my dad was raised in that system, I don't think he understood that about himself until much later in his life. But he had to scratch that itch. He had to keep trying new things. It was really only until his health, in his late 70s that he started to slow down for a long, long while. He and my mother would move from place to place in Australia so that my dad could work as a locum for other health practitioners that needed to go take a holiday or take care of an ailing relative. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I have gypsy parents, and it's stuck with me too. I'm living in this house here. We moved in here in May of this year. So my parents are now up to 38 houses. I don't count them anymore.
Okay, so it's May. It seems like it's time to move out to somewhere else, Alan, if you've been there since May.
My forever girlfriend and I went and looked at a property just yesterday morning.
And I was just joking. Yeah, I've actually moved around a lot in my life as well. But it's interesting how those early years really form you as a person, and how you have that empathy for other people in that situation, and that comes through on your show as well, which I really admire.
Thank you.
There's a question here, relating to your dad. Like, you didn't realize he was an entrepreneur. I don't think I realized I was one either. But when I look back, I even remember as a 13-year-old, I was. Sounds really weird, but I was making rings. My father, he was a scientist actually, and then I'd be in the garage and we'd smelt lead and something else and make pewter, and then I'd make cast and pour it in, and then use his grinder and make these nice patterns on rings. And that was my start of my entrepreneurial journey. And I gave them to my sister, and she took them to the school to sell them to all her friends and gave them all away.
Really?
That was the start of my entrepreneurial journey.
a pricing problem there, a distribution channel problem.
Yeah, pricing is a big issue actually today. It
was a freemium model.
Yeah, she was happy and her friends were happy, but I wasn't too happy. But I still enjoyed the process. But yeah, I've been an entrepreneur all my life without really realizing it. You're listening to Startup Journeys, Founders Unplugged with Paul King. Yeah, so the question I have,
sure.
Do you think people are born as an entrepreneur, or it's innate, or do you think it's something that can happen over time? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's a degree of entrepreneurship in everyone. I think part of the starting conditions required to create an entrepreneur is being a little bit marginalized, being a little bit on the edge. But I don't see a lot of people very, very comfortable in the niche that they occupy, deciding to throw it all away and become an entrepreneur. You just don't meet a lot of people who have had a really successful, who are widely considered to be the best merchant banker or commercial lawyer or politician, decide to risk it all and become an entrepreneur. So there needs to be either a degree of marginalization or a sudden shock to the system, because economic or social or psychological or emotional shocks can bump somebody out of the path that they were on and force them to try and find a new way to make sense of themselves and the world around them. I think another thing which is really, really important is creativity. I don't see anybody creating real value for themselves or the world around them by just carbon copying something that they've seen or read or with greatest respect listened to on a podcast. You have to take what you've been given and make changes to it that make it better or more profitable or grow faster or more meaningful to customers or to an audience.
Yeah. I interviewed recently Nick McNaughton. He's a VC in Australia, and he was a mentor at the Macquarie University Incubator. And he was saying one of the things he looks for as an investor are people that have been in the space for a long time, really understand the problems that exist, and have a better way of doing that. That's one of the things that he looks for.
Yeah, Nick's a lovely guy, and I remember him from back in the early days of the internet. He was working in online dating, and now online dating's no big deal. It's probably the way that most single people looking for a partner find someone. But back in those days, that was a really sort of edgy, risky, sort of slightly dodgy sort of perception. And you've met Nick. He's really quite he's a wonderful, warm human being, but he presents, quite traditionally and a little bit conservatively, and so he needed to take a risk. He needed to be ambitious and needed to step outside of his comfort zone to give that a try, and it paid off massively for him.
Yeah, absolutely, and he's invested in a lot of successful companies and others. So talking about investing, so you're an angel investor. So on your blog post recently, you wrote about 4 different things that nearly all investors look for. Can you just tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, it's a simplification, obviously, but it's also a helpful starting point for anybody who wants to build a startup that might require investment capital. So maybe I can start first of all by saying, not everybody has to raise money from any kind of investor or borrow money from the bank. And so raising investment gets headlines, gets you in the press, but it's at the end of the day, it's just borrowing money, right? So it's just like going to the bank and borrowing money from the bank. Slight difference is the people offering it to you are a little bit more unconventional than bankers, and also angel investors and VCs aren't going to ask you to put down your house as security before they'll give you the loan. But otherwise, it's borrowing, right? And so it increases the burn rate of the company effectively, because eventually you have to pay that back with interest, right? So with interest in the case of VC or angel investors, is probably means that you'll owe them 5 to 10 times the money that they put in. So it's not insignificant. I have huge respect and respect anybody who weighs up the options and decides to continue to bootstrap their startup, to power the business out of money that they've accrued, saved, to get it to a point of break-even or profitability, or just to power the business through the revenue coming in through early sales. So let's say, bootstrappers, more power to you. Let's put you over here. And then for the people who don't think that that's going to be possible for the business that they want to build, angel investment and VC capital basically breaks down to angel investors are people investing their own money coming out of their own bank account. And then venture capital investors are investing other people's money. So they take money from investors, a group of investors, and then they manage that money on their behalf and invest it in startups. So for angel investors, the bar is a little lower sometimes, but for VC, basically it boils down to investors looking for 4 things from a startup. So the first thing, and perhaps the easiest thing, is to have a rockstar team. So a rockstar team in startups in Australia, is typically, we're a bunch of people with no experience doing this, and we've got some skills that may or may not apply to the problem that we're addressing, but we know each other really well. We work together in a company, or we went to university together, or we're friends socially, and that's not really what rockstar means when it comes to startups. So a rockstar team in startups are people with relevant prior experience building startups, and ideally building startups that have been commercially successful, and ideally commercially successful startups related to the new idea that you want to work on. So that's what investors look for in a startup. Now, not everybody on the team needs to be somebody with all of those skills and experiences, but gee, it really helps you get a second meeting with a VC for at least one of you has worked at a startup loosely related to what you're hoping to do now, and that it was successful.
What if their previous ones weren't successful, but they still worked in that space and it failed, but they still gained that experience?
Yeah, they're helpful if they can tell a believable story about what they learned from that and how they're going to apply that to their next startup. Absolutely. So investors know as much as a founder knows that 9 out of 10 startups will fail, or even worse, 19 out of 20 startups will fail. So most of the experience that we get in startups will be with startups that failed. But if you want an investor to say, yes, absolutely, I'd be happy to have a coffee with you, it really helps to be somebody who's been an early member of a team that was commercially successful. So that's one, rockstar team. Yeah. 2 is unique, commercially applicable intellectual property. and unique and commercially applicable are 2 important things, right? So often you'll see a startup coming out of a university research project, and it'll satisfy the qualification of being unique. It'll be some sort of application of using cubicle zircon to bounce laser beams off a mirror. I don't know, science, right? Sciencey stuff, and so that may well be unique, but it needs also to qualify as commercially applicable. So you may not have ironed out all of the kinks in the commercial strategy. You may not yet be entirely clear who the key customer is and what the pricing model is and how big the total addressable market is. But the investor needs to believe that there might be a very valuable commercial application of that unique intellectual property. So for all those founders out there who are thinking about going out and building Facebook for dogs, and I get pitched Facebook for dogs about once every 3 months. People come back to me with that one. They say, I'm a dog owner and my dog has friends down the dog park, and I think it would be really great for me to have an app on my phone where I can check to see whether my dog's friends are down at the park right now, because then I'll go down and I'll meet them there. We want to share photos of our dogs and videos of our dogs having fun, and we want to meet other owners of dog breeds like ours. And seriously, I get this every 3 months, and the real problem with this idea is it's not sufficiently differentiated to Facebook. Facebook can do this, or it can do it through Instagram. Anytime it likes, anytime you like, you can start a Facebook group for your local dog park, and you can be the admin of it, and you can curate the people that use it and how they use it. So that's an example of something which you believe is unique, but is actually not unique enough. And an investor might help you find that difference. Then the third thing, which investors love to see, is customer growth. All right, so people using your product, and that's it. So I'm kind of ranking these in the order of how difficult they are to achieve before you go out and raise investment. So we're getting progressively more difficult. So if you've got a business model that needs to be funded by investors, if you can get it to the point where it's already got customers, then you're one step ahead of most of the other people who are trying to raise money with just a product, and you're also 2 steps ahead of the people who are trying to raise money who've got a great idea for a product but only have a team. So customers and customer growth is difficult to achieve, but if you can do it without investment, it makes you much more interesting to investors just to get started. And then the final thing, the most difficult of all without investment, is to have increasing revenue. So it needn't be profitable revenue, but off the back of those customers that you have, if you're able to persuade them to pay money for something, then you've got a proof that you're solving a valuable problem. And that's ultimately what investors are interested in backing. We're all looking for a new business that is solving valuable problems in a better way. So you'll be solving it in a better way if you're earning growing revenue from it in a market where you already have competitors solving it in a worse way. And you'll be solving it in a better way if the growth in customers and the growth in revenue suggests to those customers really appreciate how you're solving it for them.
Yeah, and it really is in order of priority as well, or difficulty. In our startup, we spent a lot of time. We were bootstrapping. We spent a lot of time on development,
Hmm.
and not enough time or money on sales and marketing. And so it was frustrating. Like we thought, okay, let's just get the sales and do it that way without even getting any investors. That was the original idea. But then when the money started running out, we're like, okay, we really need to get onto sales, and then there just wasn't money in the end. So it's sort of frustrating that you got something really good and you do need some
Yeah.
investment to, because there was others that are doing something similar to us that
Yeah.
came way later than us, and the only difference, and they're very successful, is that they had like 8 business development guys, sales guys, and the other were
Yeah.
12, and they really took off. And it was just me trying to do the sales,
But
which
that's Paul. Such a familiar story. It's such a familiar story that I actually have a T-shirt that talks about that. So I make and sell T-shirts for fun, for charity, actually. But one of my designs says most people in tech startups start out thinking this is all about building interesting technology, only to discover that this is mostly about sales and marketing.
absolutely,
You know?
absolutely, it's key, isn't it? I mean, I think the ideal like co-founders would be somebody, sales and marketing person, and then a CTO. That I think them coming together would be ideal. And in our case, it was two of us with an education background that saw a real problem there. And I knew a bit about development, and neither of us knew anything about sales or marketing. And that's where we
You know
came.
what? I would actually say that if you could only have one person in the team, so I would say probably the most important hire in the team, or the most important founding team member of the team, is a product manager. And the difference between a product manager and a CTO is that CTOs too often start out believing that they understand what the customer wants, and sales and marketing people too often start out believing that they know what the customer wants. Product managers are trained to go out and discover what the customer really wants through customer interview processes, to do real valid customer research.
Yeah.
So you meet a lot of startup founders in Australia who have been customers themselves, So I've been working as a car salesperson, and all the time I've been in the industry. This one problem affects me and affects everybody else in the industry. So I decided I was going to solve that problem with technology, right? And so this is why I'm pitching you today, Alan. And the problem with them imagining that they understand the customer problem is that the moment you stop being a car salesperson and decide to become a startup founder, you are no longer your customer. And the next part of your journey should be really discovering what all of your customers want, because they will all want something slightly different in terms of solution to what you had,
Yeah.
right? And so I would say, if there's only one member of the team, I would want it to be a product manager as a founder. If there are 2 members of the team, I'd like to have a sales and marketing person and a product manager, because you don't need a technical person, an engineer of some kind, to build something until you really deeply understand what it is that you're going to solve for your customers.
You're listening to Startup Journeys, Founders Unplugged with Paul King.
Probably the biggest inflection point in my professional career was joining Yahoo as an early employee. I was employee number 118 and got to go through the whole dot-com boom. With that experience and coming out of Yahoo, I thought that I could be that I was qualified to be a successful tech startup founder, because I'd been an early hire on a team once. But one data point isn't very useful as a sample size, and so I was full of hubris. I had money and I had time, and I didn't have to get back to a full-time job anytime soon. So I really wanted to have a go at being a startup founder myself. And so I tried a lot of different crazy and stupid ideas. But probably the biggest one was actually a really, really good idea. And it ultimately failed what I learned about that, I guess, is the point of the story. But so me and three other ex-Yahoos who'd worked closely together for 5 years, and so we had relevant experience in a related industry, and we had a full set of skills. We had a technical person. I was the product person. We had a commercial officer. We had an amazing salesperson as our CEO, and we had seen the early growth of Netflix in the US market, and it seemed clear that Netflix was going to focus on the US for the time being, for the next few years. And I don't know if you'll remember, but Netflix originally wasn't streaming because the internet couldn't cope with that much data. They were sending DVDs out to people in the mail. Yeah. So we thought maybe we could build a Netflix-like business in Australia and copy some elements of their business model, adapt other elements to what we thought about the local market, and build sort of a defensible market in Australia so that Netflix was ready to do international one day. They might just acquire us. And it would be helpful because if Netflix grew, that would set something that we could say to potential investors. Well, this is how we arrived at our valuation. These are our metrics. These are Netflix's metrics. Netflix is valued at this many billions of dollars, and therefore we're that valuable too. So there were a lot of smart things. That we did early on. One really smart thing that we did early on was when we spoke to the distributors of DVDs, we realized that the typical video and DVD rental store only had a tiny fraction of all the titles that were available. When we first started our business, there was something in excess of 40,000 DVD titles that we could have in our catalog. And of course, no DVD store in Australia was going to have enough shelf space to do that. And so we thought, okay, well, because we don't have a physical store, that's a potential huge advantage for us. And the way that rental DVDs are priced is that the recent release blockbuster titles might cost you, in excess of $100 to buy one rental copy and have the right to rent that out to customers. But then the back catalog stuff, things like, Gone with the Wind, you might be able to pick up for $3.50 and rent it out to customers. And so we knew that there would be potentially, a percentage of our target audience who would want to watch the latest release blockbusters. But if we could persuade them to also watch a classic title that they hadn't seen before, we were charging about the same for a monthly subscription either way, we could make them a much more profitable customer. So that was our mission from the early days. And I think that was a pretty smart move. But nobody's going to browse through 40,000 titles to find something that they want to watch. So we also understood very early on that we had to give them a way to surface those classic titles, and we also needed to learn about their tastes in movies so that we were recommending the right things to them, right? So right at the very early days, we realized we're going to have to build a recommendation algorithm, which at that time was a very rare and special thing. There weren't very many recommendation algorithms out there in the world. So we found a way to do that so that we could, when somebody started as a customer with us, we could show them 4 or 6 very polarizing movie titles and with relative confidence that they've probably seen them before, and just ask them to rate them out of 5 stars. Have you seen this title before? And if so, rate it out of 5 stars for us. We only had to do that one time. And then we would get a pretty good read on what kind of customer we had before us, and we could start recommending other things that they would watch. Which would be a mix of latest release blockbusters and also back catalog stuff that we had that we could afford to rent out much more cheaply. Those were all the really smart things that we did. Probably the dumb thing that we did was we were a little bit early for the Australian market. The US market was much more advanced than the Australian market, and so people were much more ready to have a crack at this. And it was much cheaper in the US to distribute things in the mail to customers. And the US Postal Service, a lot of Australian consumers don't realize this, but the US Postal Service works both ways. So there's a little flag on a letterbox in the US. When the way they use that flag is that indicates to the postman that there's something waiting to be picked up from your letterbox. And so in a DVD delivery business, you have to deliver the DVDs to the customer, but then the customer has to send them back to you. And so in the US, you just put them back in your letterbox. In Australia, you have to go and find a post box. And as we know, Australia
Yeah.
Australia Post has been shrinking for decades, and those red boxes are fewer and fewer and far between. And so that was one pretty big flaw in our model. And Australia Post wasn't really set up to take good care of our DVDs, so we had a really high breakage rate, no matter what we tried to do with our packaging. And then the other big difference was the Australian marketing distribution channels were much more concentrated than they were in the US. So because most Australians weren't spending a lot of time online back then, we still had to reach Australian consumers through traditional marketing channels. So ads on the back of buses and cinema ads and television ads and print magazine ads, and all of those things were very expensive to do, and it was difficult to know for sure whether people were seeing them or whether they were responding to them. So ultimately that business ran out of puff because we raised capital to do that traditional marketing, and our cost of acquiring a customer, because of all that traditional marketing and our breakage rates, and the fact that we now had several competitors in the market, made it very, very challenging to prove to investors that we would have a growing business. So we raised a seed round of capital, a few $1 million. But then we weren't able to show enough traction to successfully raise a second round. So we found an exit for the business. We were able to engineer an exit with another player in the market who had started around the same time as us. And they were listed on the ASX, and so their ASX investors needed a good story every quarter. And so we negotiated a buyout. So they acquired our company, which was, we got out of it with some valuable experience. We got to pay ourselves a salary for a while. We built an awesome team. We learned a lot about recommendation algorithms and distribution in Australia. So it was by no means a complete failure, but in terms of a return for investors and in terms of creating a valuable company that we could then sell, we could have done a lot better, I guess.
Yeah, it's really interesting, especially that recommendation algorithm. I mean, those sort of algorithms are used everywhere now. I mean, like Netflix or all through social media. In fact, not the recommendation algorithms, but there's a lot of other algorithms that are causing a lot of issues, like polarizing people. But if you look back then, where how you had to put advertisements on bus or TV, magazines, and all that. Now with social media, we sometimes I listen to Gary Vee, and it's like, this stuff is free. Like, you can, like what we're doing now, for example, put up on YouTube and Spotify. It's all free. It's like, it is really pretty amazing, the resources that we have now compared to that.
It is, but the main social media companies have been smart enough to realize at the very beginning that what they were building what was a platform that would ultimately become paid. So all of the large social media platforms will give you a certain amount of audience for free, but then if you want more, you have to pay.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's a subtle thing that they won't explicitly make apparent to you, but then eventually you'll figure this out. You'll go, okay, I can reach this much audience for free, but then if I want any more, I'm going to have to start paying to run little promotions. And initially, those promotions will be, here's a popular post that you have. You could buy this many more viewers of this post, which you created for free by paying us a little bit. That's how they get you into advertising, and then eventually they start requiring you to create specific ads just to build an audience for your page or your group or your destination.
Yeah. Actually, thinking back when I was working at TAFE Digital, I actually started social media in TAFE. And I was investigating that time. Oh, should we do Facebook page, MySpace?
Cool.
Facebook page, luckily, and built that up quite a bit. And I remember I'd post something and would go out to everybody. And then once they went public, then you'd post something and it'd go to 10% of people. And it was so frustrating. But that's the whole revenue model. So
yeah, everybody who's invested a lot of time in their profile on Twitter has is now complaining about how Twitter has changed for the worse since Elon Musk took over, and that's I think that's always going to be a risk as well. Anytime you rely on a third party for your distribution to reach an audience or a customer base, then there's a risk that you might lose that access at some point in the future.
Yeah, absolutely, and MySpace is a great example of that. So it disappeared. Okay, so you emphasize the importance of storytelling for startups. Can you share a compelling example where a startup's narrative significantly contributed to its success?
Yeah, I can provide a couple of examples. What I guess I'd like to do first of all is explain why I think storytelling is so important in startups.
Yes.
So the reason why is that when you set out to build a startup, you have in mind a future version of the world where the startup that you're planning to build has made the world a better place in some way. So you don't set out to build a world that doesn't change as a result of your startup. You want this thing to be really meaningful in the world. It's going to create change. That change is going to come in the future. And you've got that in your mind. You believe in that, otherwise you wouldn't set out to do this. And if you've got co-founders, they believe in it too. But the rest of the world doesn't have that vision in their head, right? And that vision is wholly imaginary at this stage because it's a future vision. And when anybody outside of a startup meets a startup for the first time, it's just a couple of people with an idea, or even just one person with an idea. And so people don't walk around in their daily lives wanting to believe in a fairy story about the future. People have to be persuaded to believe that that might even be a possibility, much less will definitely happen, right? So startup founders have to make the best use of every opportunity they have to try and make people believe that their version of the future might actually be real, and if there's some question as to whether or not it will eventuate, then you have to make them believe that, well, what's the upside here? Like if we were successful, what would be, what value would be created? How would we make the world a better place? How big could this be if it works? So that just doesn't happen by accident, So people won't give you enough time to unpack the whole vision, and people have other things to do with their day, and so you have to find ways to stop and get their consent to tell them a little story about the future, and then make that story compelling enough that, first of all, they will retain it and think about it as the future unfolds, and B, help them understand it enough so that at a very high level, they might be able to share that with other people, right? Because we all only have 18 waking hours in the day, and you might be a team of 4 people, but that's like 4 times 18. So you only have so many hours to build your startup, and so many hours to tell a compelling story to other people, to make them believe that this might be possible, and make them think about, what might happen if this works, and to make them retain enough of it that they might tell another person and another person, because it's the compounding interest of one person telling another person that makes most startups succeed in the end, whether those other people might be future potential investors, future potential employees, future potential customers, future potential regulators, journalists, and another important thing to expect is that none of us go on this journey alone. So we all need to be supported by our loved ones, by our family, by our life partner, by our friends. We all have to seek leave to pursue this vision, and perhaps neglect those relationships a little bit. And then when we fall down, we need them to help pick us up. So we haven't taken them along with us on the journey. If they don't believe and care about this nearly as much as we do, then we're going to miss out on their help and support when the time comes. So that's why I think storytelling is so important. So I'm going to tell 2 brief stories and not mention the person or the startup. But there used to be an awesome tech conference that ran every year in Sydney for 20 years, I guess, called Tech 23. And at Tech 23, 23 startups would come up and pitch during the course of a day. They'd come up and pitch with 2 other startups that were in a similar sort of industry category. And then each startup would take a turn at pitching and then being interviewed by an expert panel. And this really was an expert panel of VCs and industry leaders. So they would be grilled live on stage for about 5 minutes after their pitch. So in front of an audience of 300-400 people, a lot of investors and other founders in the room. And so a very, very high stakes, stressful experience. And so part of the reason of going along to buying a ticket for Tech 23 is because you wanted to see people fall over. You wanted to see the wheels come off the wagon. You wanted to sometimes see the pitch go horribly wrong. So that sort of gladiatorial combat side of it was a reason why a lot of people bought a ticket. But every now and again, you would see somebody absolutely blow the audience away. So I saw a 23-year-old founder stand up on the stage. He was still a university student. He was about to drop out of university to pursue the startup vision that he and his co-founder had. His co-founder was also 23 or thereabouts. They hadn't completed their electrical engineering degrees yet, but they had this idea to solve a really significant problem in an industry where there was tremendous waste and where the problem wasn't being solved for customers well enough. And so he was setting out on this journey, and he told a really beautiful crafted story. It had a beginning, it had a middle, it had an end. And it hinted at some of the challenges that the company was going to face along the way, but it didn't try and anticipate any of the questions that the panel might have. It just hinted at that they might have some solutions to some of these problems. And the really smart thing about telling the story that way was that it actually made the panel, it gave them hints at where they should ask questions. You should ask a question about this part of the business, right? And so that meant that the panel weren't reaching for questions to ask. They were given hints, and they seized upon those hints at question time. The next beautiful thing about what the founder had done was that he was prepared to answer each of all those questions. He knew their line of questioning up front because he had hinted at where the challenges might lie. And so he had a beautifully crafted, succinct, respectful, but devastatingly effective answer for each of the questions that he was asked. So one of the other investors in that room saw that pitch, the same as I saw that pitch, and he emailed about 5 people later that same day and said, look, I think I'm going to lead a $500,000 angel investment in this company. Who's with me? And I was one of the people who said yes. At that stage, 24 hours later, I hadn't spoken to the founder myself. I hadn't spoken to the other investors really much about why they were excited about this company. But I just saw this founder just sweep the audience up in his arms and make them believe in a version of the future that included his company making a significant difference in the world. And he had been smart enough to seed his panel with questions that he knew he had awesome answers for. So he won the competition that day, the competitive part of the pitch, but he also won the audience's heart. And he closed within a week a $500,000 seed round. So that's an example of how that can really work. Another awesome example is there was a startup that came through the StartMate program, and it's difficult to keep them anonymous. But what I will say is that StartMate is a 3-month program which usually accepts founders who have already built a prototype or a minimum viable product, and spend most of the 3 months of the program learning about how to commercialize, how to market, how to get out in front of customers and build the confidence to sell it to them. So this company spent its entire 3 months actually out there with customers and selling, but they didn't have a product. And at demo day, they didn't have a product, but what they had was incredible customer and revenue traction. So the founder who got up on stage and spoke talked about that journey and about how challenging it had been to sell something to customers without a product. They had to run the business with whiteboards and Post-it notes, and by the end of the 3 months of the accelerator program, they were by far and away the most successful team in the whole cohort of 10 companies in terms of customer and revenue growth in that time. So he just kept coming back to, and then month 1, and then month 2, and then month 3, building. So when he said at the end of his pitch, and now we've just launched the first version of our tech platform, the audience was primed to think, well, how fantastic will this business be? And, now it has a product, and it already has such great customer growth. So he could have started his story by saying, we've been failing because we didn't have a product, right? But he focused on their strengths, and he brought it home at the end. The one weakness in the business he was now about to solve. And so that company, again, that's now operating in 5 or 6 markets around the world. The founding team moved over to Europe to work on the business there because that was their biggest global market. Huge ambition and not limited by the fact that they didn't have a product to sell. They had a service to sell until they had the skills and the team to build a product around that service.
You're listening to Startup Journeys, Founders Unplugged with Paul King. So I had this really horrible experience where a VC at question time after a pitch was really aggressive and just made me feel really horrible. And I've heard stories. A friend of mine, she said, "Oh, sometimes they're trying to test you and that sort of thing." But my experience at pitch night with you, the questions that you asked, not me, but the others, and your manner and your feedback was really, really positive, which I think is totally the right way to do things. But if you do get in that situation, how can you handle that? And also, what are your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Paul. Thank you. So I think most of my answers begin with a little preamble, and so the preamble to answering your question is that I think every industry goes through an important inflection point when most members of the general public believe that they understand what this industry is about. And the startup industry is still a relatively new industry, and we're approaching that point now, an inflection point in our industry. And so I remember, a lot of Australians didn't really understand what happens inside a law firm until they first started watching the series LA Law. I think that was an inflection point. I remember, friends that I was going to university with at the time going, "I think I want to be a lawyer." And I go, "Really? What?" Yeah. Because LA Law is a very, dramatic and entertaining sort of version of loosely based on what the legal profession is really like, right? And the startup industry has a show. It has a couple now, but by far the most popular one in Australia is a show called Shark Tank, which have, like most things, started out in the US, and now there is an Australian version of Shark Tank. Just like LA Law, Shark Tank is loosely based on one of the dynamics that happens in startups, where founders will get up and pitch to investors, and investors will ask them questions and sometimes give them pretty frank feedback. But unfortunately, just like LA Law, Shark Tank isn't really how investing works. Some of the people who watch a show like Shark Tank will, subsequently be invited to be a judge at a startup pitch event. And unfortunately, I think some of those people go, "Oh, I know what my job is. I need to be like a Shark Tank pitch judge," right? So I've worked with a number of startups who've been on Shark Tank before, and I think most audiences don't realize that a filming of one pitch on Shark Tank might take more than an hour, and only a few minutes of that total hour will appear on the show. And the reason why is that the producers are working with the sharks and are working with the founders to try and tell a story. Try and make something entertaining. So on most episodes of Shark Tank, one team will be successful and all the audience will go, "Oh, yes, that were the best by far," right? And another team will be almost successful, but will end up, declining the offer from the sharks, and the audience will go, "Oh, that was silly to decline that offer." And then one team will be the losers. They'll be the team who are made fun of or come across as a bit ridiculous, or right. And all of those storylines are entirely fabricated, right? So all of those teams, the losing team did much, much better in its pitch to Shark Tank than the producers make it look. So that is a confected version of reality. And so when there's people who watch Shark Tank and who believe their role on the pitch panel is to be like a Shark Tank judge, that they are mistaken. They are mistaken. That's not what they are there to do. So first, let's recognize that anybody getting up on stage and pitching to a friendly room of people even is doing something that makes them uncomfortable. And they're doing something which requires a degree of vulnerability. Remembering that every startup founder is pitching their version of the future that doesn't exist yet, and they lack the resources, they lack the team, they lack the capital, they lack pretty much everything that they need to make this a reality. I think we owe them a huge debt of warmth and support, just for the fact that they're prepared to get up there and do that. So that's my starting position. It's a difficult thing to do. It makes you very uncomfortable. You stand up there full of imposter syndrome, and you have a crack at telling a believable story about your version of the future without most of the things that you will need to make that future come to life. So I think anybody who is given the opportunity to be a pitch judge should start out from that point. And then the second point, 19 out of 20 startups will ultimately fail. And so the odds of everybody getting up there and pitching that story of their version of the future, it's probably going to, at best, lend in experiences and skills that they'll be able to take on to the next startup that might be a little bit more successful. So let's encourage them. Let's help them on that journey, right? So let's try and find some supportive, actionable advice that at the very least might make their next pitch land better, right? And if not their pitch, then perhaps their business model or their strategy for marketing or some solution, some advice, some connection, some help that might help the business move forward. So we can take 19 out of 20 down to 18 out of 20 at some point in the future. So I think those should be the two goals of any feedback that a startup founder gets when they pitch. And for the rest of us, when we're given that opportunity, when a university or a private accelerator program or incubator says, hey, we would love you to be one of our judges of our pitch event. Remember, this is a huge opportunity for you, right? So you have the opportunity to be seen as an expert for a period of time. And none of us is, I'm not. I'm still learning. I'm still on my way towards being a better mentor, a better coach, a better investor. So I think if we keep that mindset when we go to the stage and go, this is a huge honor for me. This is a great opportunity for me to project the person that I'm becoming in this industry. And then this is a person who's taking a huge risk by standing up on stage and telling a story about their version of the future without most of what they need to make that happen. Let me see if I can help them do a little bit better job of both the story that they tell and the business that they want to create. I think that makes for a much better, much more useful evening for the audience, a much less gladiatorial combat, and much more likely to be future startup successes for everybody who attends that event. I think that's the better version of the future that I'd like to try and create myself.
Absolutely, and you practice what you preach as well.
Thank you.
Pretty impressive. Your judging the other night at Macquarie, and the advice as well. I remember on one of the pitch decks, you said less information, more visuals, and talking. Not to the slides. Look, so many different things. And I would also recommend people listen to one of your episodes. That talks about pitching as well, which is excellent. So.
Thank you. It's become such a big thing for me that I do workshops now for incubators and accelerator programs. So my pitching and storytelling workshops, I probably do that about 12 times a year now, and I absolutely love doing it. It's something that I love spending a lot of time on. I think storytelling is so key to the journey of success for any startup. So yeah, if you're an operator, if you're somebody running a program like that, find a way to get in touch with me, and let's see if I can help you and your startups.
Yeah, we'll leave all that information in the show notes as well.
Thanks, man.
So to finish off, Alan, if you could give only one piece of advice to an early stage startup founder, what would that be?
One piece of advice.
Only one.
Well, often for many people, it's the four things that investors look for in a startup. Because I meet so many people trying to pitch for investment that they haven't got them. And the best thing, if you don't have one or more of the things in the four, then you can take that list of 50 or 100 things that you have in your to-do list, and you can focus on the subset of those things that might help get you across the line with one of those four things you need for investment. So a rockstar team, unique, commercially applicable intellectual property, customer growth, and revenue growth, right? So ultimately, you'll need as many of those four things as you can if you're going to be successful raising investment. But at least if you're pitching to investors with a realistic expectation that that you don't have those four things yet, you can at least direct your questions to the investor that you meet with, or how might you help? How do you think I should go about getting those of four things in place so that when I meet you again, I get that investment. I think so. The most important thing, the one thing I'm going to tell you is if you get an opportunity to meet somebody who's an investor and you don't have those four things in place, you should make that opportunity to meet them mostly about the questions you ask them, not the questions they ask you. So shortest possible version of your startup pitch that you can deliver. It's just so that they can understand what you're working on and where you come from, and what your version of your future might look like if it succeeds. Their reflective reaction is going to be to start asking you questions. But as best as you can, you should try and turn that around to asking them questions, because that's how you're going to get to the four things that you don't currently have: their expert advice, their experience. Most investors in Australia are coming from a startup founder background themselves these days, particularly angel investors, and they might have the keys to unlock the next step of your success.
Great advice. So thank you so much for
Thanks,
coming
Paul.
on the podcast today. It's early days for me, and I appreciate you giving up your time and your expertise. And
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
and look, go out and listen to Disrupt Radio. Listen to yourself and Megan Flamer. Great episodes as well. And thank you so
Paul.
much, Helen. We'll maybe chat again in the future.
I hope you have a wonderful summer break, and I'd love to bump into you again at another event soon.
Okay, I'm sure I will. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you.